Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Water Cooler Gossip on 6++. This is our lunchtime, nattery, chatty format. We've done one, so now it's a tradition. We really enjoyed the last one. It was really fun to have so many of you chiming in. Today, we're talking about 10th in general. I'm going to make a pitch for it being my favourite edition. And it's going to be very interesting to see whether Scribbo agrees with me, because he may not. And I'll be very interested to get your thoughts in the chat as well on the overall edition and its place in your own hobby lives and histories as well. And we'll natter a bit more widely about the news. We've got Eldar dropping. Eldar's out and about. Obviously got Slaanesh doing Slaanesh-y things at the moment, so we'll chat about some of those things as well. And maybe think a little bit about where we're going in terms of our own 40k approach to those things. I'll introduce Scribbo first, because he's here. He's given up his lunchtime to come and join me. But Scribbo, how are you?
I'm good. I'm a little cold, but can't complain otherwise. So.
Very nice. And have you done any nerding since I last saw you?
I've started rebasing my entire Dark Angels army because apparently I needed more things to do.
That's fair. That's fair. And what's the rebasing? What's the goal there?
So traditionally I'd done all of my Space Marine Imperium stuff all on Astrogranite when I first started.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which then meant as I've got a little bit more black armor involved, it looks a bit shite. It looked a bit flat. So I was like,
it's a bit dark, isn't it? Yeah.
So after kind of getting into the whole lore element of like the lion and his forest walk stuff, I was like, I want to do foresty bases. So I started kind of doing a brown with some nice grass. I got some from Element Games, which was really cool. And I've just got a bag of little leaves to put on as well. So it's just something a bit more exciting. And I think that will help the army pop. So
yeah, definitely. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I've been dabbling in a different 40k army myself, which I will talk about a little bit later because it's relevant to our discussion. That's been my main thing, just trying to get ready for options for Pyro. But obviously, we're looking ahead to the ITT as well, where I'll be playing the old GSC, who remain really fun. Right, I'll shout out the chat. We'll do our brief bit of promo, then we'll get into the topic. So I can see Alex Fowler's in. Hi, Alex. I played a couple of good games against Alex Fowler last week. What a player he is. And he's in, just finished a work call, and now a lunchtime Skive. Yeah, that's the idea with these guys. We want this to be your Skive territory. If you've got your lunch break, you want to just hang about, have a bit of a 40k natter going on in the background. That's the goal. So obviously, do hit the old like and subscribe. Please do leave us a comment as well. That's all really useful. Hello, Adam in the chat. Afternoon, Sons of Plus. Yeah, Sons of Plus. The Knights of the Plus. And obviously, we've hit 90 YouTube members. We're really happy with that. We're trying to get on our way to 100 YouTube members. So if you haven't signed up to support us yet, and you don't mind donating a couple of pounds a month, that'd be amazing. Obviously, also, we do run coaching and mentoring as well. If you're interested in coming and getting some of that, drop us a message in the Discord. Come join the Discord anyway. It's amazing. There's tons of stuff going on in there. Right. Oh, and we've got Vic VJ in as well. Vic, I'm very curious what your favourite edition of 40k is and why. So do pipe up. So here's the pitch, guys. I'm going to make my case. I'm going to be making my case to Scribbo that 10th is my favourite edition of 40k. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. We have a lot of conversations around different editions, and I do think it's complicated, but I think overall I've had an awful lot of enjoyment in 10th edition. And I was thinking about why that is and how that all fits together. I know Scriv has his own thoughts on this, and actually Scriv has been around a lot longer than me, so he might be able to offer some perspective that grounds me a little bit. But I'm really curious to all of you in the chat as well. You know, what do you like about 10th edition? Are there any other editions past you preferred? Why might that be? Do pipe up. Hello to Stanley, my fellow GSC player in the chat as well. So Scribbo, here's my pitch. I'm going to start with my pitch, and then you'll interject, disagree, dispute me at any stage, and we'll get into it as well.
Objection.
You're brilliant. You're perfect. He's ready to go. Me and Scribbo occasionally disagree. You might know that about this. We'd actually do it that much on content. To be fair, it's mostly all the rest of the time.
Yeah, heated WhatsApp messages where I'm like, yeah. Are you joking? I can't sense the tone here, Tom. Are you telling me off, Tom? Am I wrong, Tom? It's always that, right? It's always me.
Oh, I'm very driven behind the scenes. Right. I'm going to set the scene for you, right? So I think there are many ways to attack this, both as how a 40k edition is experienced for new players, but also has experience for ones who are getting up to speed and in the swing of things and are very capable and understand the game really well. For myself, I started playing in 8th edition, so I've not been around that long. But I was thinking back over my formative experience of how 8th edition was, and there's a number of different things that really stood out to me if you're comparing it to how I think it is for a new player now, right? So the first example, so I chose a starter army, I chose Death Guard. And I really enjoyed building up and painting my Death Guard, but they essentially, once I started segueing into sort of competitive side, Death Guard were barely functional in a competitive sense. They couldn't really play into almost any of the armies that were out there in the game at that time. And they stayed that way essentially until the very last books of 8th edition gave them an update, right? I think they got an update that gave them some new rules, and suddenly they were able to compete a little bit. But the army I'd actually chosen basically was flatlining, non-competitive, non-functional for most of the edition I played it, right?
Yeah.
I was also, once starting to collect it, very, very quickly directed to either units not in that faction, so Nurgle demons, or Forge World expensive dreadnoughts like Derrideos, these kinds of things. A bunch of stuff which, to me, coming in from the outside, picking up my codex, looking at the models, you're like, oh, so actually to play this in any way that works, I need to get a bunch of stuff that isn't in this army and isn't really part of, as I saw it, wasn't what I wanted to be doing. I do love Noble Demons, but that's fine. That's okay. We made my peace with that. My memory of it from a terrain standpoint was that in 8th, there were a huge variation of terrain metas, but there was a tendency for them to be quite open and quite shooty, right? A lot of games I played through most of 8th edition, especially at tournaments and smaller ones, felt like they were decided by who went first, like a lot of the time. And they had the old seize the initiative, the seize roll, yeah. The seize roll, which is like your chance to claw it back. And I remember my observation of armies out in the game was that there was a huge amount of just pure stat skew. So pure horde, pure tanks, pure sort of single statistical checking. But there was also a lot of, like, again, Forge World plugins, right? Leviathan Dreadnoughts in every list, Derrideos popping up all over the place. That, I think, was my lasting memories of 8th. There were lots of fun things you could do, and I think they hit their stride with the Psychic Awakening towards the end. There were some interesting adaptations then. But I guess that then takes us, for me, to 9th edition, which from where I was standing was defined. I said the end of 8th kind of counts in my head with the release of Marines when they did Marines again. It felt like from the end of 8th through a lot of 9th edition, the entire game, and I was a more competitive player by then, but I saw it affecting everyone locally as well, was defined by new rules releases. Things would come out, they'd be so dominant that they completely shaped the entire top of the game until the next thing came out, which was often designed almost to kill the thing that had just been released. And you sort of went round in a cycle, right? So if we're thinking about the top of the game, top players were cycling from one new book to the next. The entire competitive meta at the top of the game for a lot of 9th edition was shaped by what the next thing to come out was. At times, you just have people sitting out the meta altogether because they didn't have anything that could handle this new thing that had come out. For me, I was playing Drukhari by then, so I really got to experience this firsthand. I got to get a book that was suddenly... I got a book that was too good. Like, it was too good for everyone to deal with. It was impossible to play local games that were any fun because it was simply too strong. And then... obviously, it was brought down, and it was also just repeatedly kicked in the balls by every book that came out after it because they were all designed to beat it, basically. So I felt like the release cycle was incredibly rock, paper, scissors, almost deliberately so, I would say. Almost like they were sort of having to solve their problems they'd created with the next book and going around in circles. I really liked a lot of the fundamentals of 9th, but what I would say in terms of scoring, you had your sort of secondaries that you chose, you had primaries that were quite formulaic. It felt to me as a player that more casual and sort of lower skill players really never got to grips with the secondary scoring in the way that it existed, in as much as, you'd play so many games where people just wouldn't be able to build around or have a sort of a set of secondaries that worked. And you'd end up with a lot of sort of holding pattern games where it's like, oh, well, you've just, based on the choices you've made and the start of this game, you just won't get out of this holding pattern and you'll lose. And there was some very cool techie top lists and in matchups where that was really interesting against each other. But I think for games into, local players, casual players, it felt a lot of the time like they just lost at setup. So that gets us to 10th. And with all of that in mind, here's why I'm preferring 10th overall. And we do have to shout out the indices era because that was horrible. Didn't enjoy the indices as much as, Eldar, GSC. There were a few things that dropped incredibly overpushed. But what I would say is that I think in terms of the scoring, in terms of missions, rules writing, what I like is a whole bunch of different things. I feel like 10th pushes armies to look more like armies. If I look at the list people are sharing, there's a huge mix of tools. People always need a few little sneaky scoring pieces, a few little tasteful units, force multipliers, etc. You've still got your heavy hitters, etc. But armies look quite mixed an awful lot of the time. I really like universal special rules. Things like Scout and Infiltrate just simplified the game, but also meant that armies had particular things that were really useful for them. And I think from a competitive standpoint, balance has felt very regular. Once they got the indexes under control, balance has been very regular. It's been very wide ranging. It's been very ambitious. And I think the killer thing with it is that it's often brought armies back to life and up. You know, your Tyranids, your Votan, your Admech, different things have been given buffs. Where balance in 8th and 9th was mostly just about killing off something that overcooked and just bringing it down. Which means that often after slates, I mean, we've just had a post-slate era and post-Grotmas era. What I'm loving about these moments in 10th is that the game is so wide. There are so many approaches in play that it actually feels like lots of different things can work. And it's not so easy to second guess what the obvious thing to play is. From a top of the game standpoint, what I've loved about 10th is it's been an era of faction specialists. You think about all those top players they've actually mostly played stuff they really like for most of the edition. They've been able to zero in on armies that they like and find powerful things within them, which I've really enjoyed seeing. It's not just been, they're all chasing the same army over and over again for every couple of months. And certainly anecdotally, I feel like for local and casual level, the game has been easier to pick up and armies have been easier to pick up. I feel like that whenever I'm diving into a new rule set. I've been dabbling in Salamanders for our TTS League. I'm looking at various options for Pyra. It's actually much easier to quickly get your head into a detachment and an army now than it was in 9th, while still being interesting and having stuff going on. As far as the missions and the scoring goes, I think they've balanced out that first turn problem. I enjoyed secret missions. I think they're still trying to find their way with that. I think that was an interesting addition. What I like about the secondary cards is that it's a very tightly balanced thing now, because if you drop cards, it can really impact a game. It's not so easy to just reliably push through all the cards in the game. And so small swings in games can be massive, which means the incentive is on you to be proactive and actually win the primary decisively, so you don't just have this standoffing holding pattern kind of game. So I think for me, 10th as a sort of reboot, which will probably be evolved on and go into another edition, I think it shows a lot of promise, considering we're at the start of a cycle, which I guess 8th that I joined in was the start of a cycle, right?
Yeah, it was. This
feels so much more rounded and filled out and ambitious already at this stage, and with a lot of lessons often lately learned from 8th and 9th. And we'll talk about indirect and other stuff in a minute. But I think there's a lot of room to grow here whilst it's still being very interesting. I'm going to let you respond, Scrib, and I'll just pass through the chat as well at the same time.
So I think the kind of the important thing to remember here is that's all been through the lens of a competitive player, which is a smaller percentage of the actual community than we all appreciate at times. I would argue at times 10th edition is actually worse for the more casual players. For twofold, because it's a double-edged sword. The rules are fixed so they're more balanced.
Yeah.
But they change so drastically that if they're playing once every couple of months, they come back
the keeping up.
And it's exhausting. So what you end up finding is actually your more established players that are a little less kind of engaged with what's changing will drop off. So I think what 10th edition has done really well is it's really good if you want to play a match play event and practice for those events.
Yeah.
Anything within the wheelhouse outside of that isn't Crusade is just ignored now by GW almost.
Yeah.
And that's the downside. You don't have this flavored thing that is intentionally not balanced, that is about playing a pickup game, a little story, a cool, weird mission. They don't exist anymore. And I think that is a loss to the game.
Do we think that's purely the game design, or do we think that's the way the player base has also changed?
I think there is a very vocal kind of 5 to 10% of the community that want to play at events, feel that that's what they should be doing, and then are kind of almost pushed into it by their local communities, whether they like it or not. I've watched a lot of guys go and do tournaments and then hate it because it's not for them. They want to play just a pickup game, throw dice at each other. And the problem is, I think the community then almost gets into a situation where if everyone else is playing it, people feel kind of like, well, that's how you play that game, so I have to do that. And I feel there is something lost there a little bit. And I don't think it's wrong that it's about balance, but at the same time, there becomes times where you're playing a game and you go, well, this is now just completely down to the two lists hitting into each other. There isn't as much variation to that in a weird sort of way. It's a strange one, right?
That's a couple of really valid points there. I'll start with that last one. I think the variation is a really valid point, because one thing I would say is I think 10th list design is not as expressive. Yeah. I think if you want to do something interesting, you tend to have to go and do a different detachment.
Yeah.
But actually, within a detachment, having written up all the lists this year, with Goonhammer stuff, there is not as much variety. You do get little interesting things, and I think there is room to adjust and express yourself, particularly if you have armies with larger range of models. But certain armies and certain ranges, it's really the list, right? You think Votan, it's like, well, that's the Votan list, and whatever it is at the moment in time stays pretty similar. I think your point about casual play and narrative play is very interesting. I'm not as plugged into sort of local pickup games as you, so I'd be very interested to know what that looks like at the moment. I agree, narrative and Crusade gaming, they kind of just left the Crusade rules in, didn't they, from 9th? And didn't really. Crusade was too complicated anyway.
It's bloated. It's not a pickup game thing. When it takes you twice as long to play because you've got to remember all the extra rules, it should be adding flavour, not adding paperwork. And that's the big failure of Crusade, in my opinion, for 10th. It's like you're putting a layer on top of a game that's already quite complicated at times. And it's just, And
I think that makes
biggest criticism of 10th we haven't touched on is the combat phase.
Oh, okay, go on then.
I liked the 9th edition combat phase because you could be good at doing combat.
Okay.
Now it's a little bit too dumbed down.
That's fair. I think,
but it
was I also loved it. Yeah. I remember when 10th first came out and I got to my combat phase, I'd just be like, oh, I don't know. Sorry, I don't really know. Like, I'm a bit afraid to do it wrong. But I think having made my peace with certain aspects of it, I do like combat in 10. There is still room to express things in movement and blocking and other things, coasting and piling into things. And I think I've been a bit blessed with an army with a 6-inch piling consolidate. That makes it a lot easier to find these things. Yeah, but I do think 9th edition combat was a lot of fun. Things like Heroic Intervention were a lot of fun in their original forms as well. Although I think the recent changes to make that more lively,
making it cheaper and more usable, I get.
Yeah,
I guess there's, in the kind of interest of balance, the combat had to be kind of reined in a little bit. But then there's other casualties like Psychic Phase. That was something
that's a big
never
miss
got
as well.
right.
That's
but it just feels
fair.
a shame. But it feels like maybe 10th edition they've kind of toned that down, and now we're going to have an end of edition. Let's try this out and throw in something new. So I don't think it's dead for good, but it just feels like a bit of a shot in the foot almost. Because like, do I ever see anything really exciting happen with Psychers apart from Grey Knights librarians blowing themselves up? Probably not.
I'm going to put a pin in that because we'll come back to it. I'm just going to read out some of the comments. So we had Francois Marion, who says, no wonder you think 10th is good because I only came in at 8th. 10th is utter crap. Francois, I'd love to know what the good editions were and why. Do let me know. Chris Cad says it's the last edition you played before 10th was 3rd. Likes this a lot. Okay. 3rd sounds like a long time ago. I'd be very curious what that was like.
Was good, but it needed a patch to make combat actually even a thing. So
right,
that was the last thing I did before coming back in 7th. So
nice.
That was a bit of a shock to the system.
Vic says in terms of balance, 10th, I would completely agree on that. In terms of fun, second half of 8th after rule of 3, I had a lot of fun in 8th as well. So I'm not gonna claim I didn't. I also had a ton of fun in 9th, and that roller coaster in 9th was insane. But when you were on the high bits, it felt okay, right? It was quite funny at times. And Alex thinks 9th was a shit show right up until Arcs of Omen. Yeah, I'd agree, and it's a shame because Arcs introduced quite an interesting era for balance. Francois says I haven't played against 5 Catan. Oh, I have. I don't mind Catan, Francois. Catan are okay. Vic says melee rules in 9th. Yeah, melee rules in 9th were just, I think I'm agreed with Scriv. It was very, very good. Francois just thinks 8th and 9th sucked, which is why 10th is the favourite. Okay, so 2nd and 7th are getting some shout outs from Francois. So talk to me about 7th. All I've heard about 7th makes me think I would have hated to play it because it had invisible things and 2-up invuns and all sorts of things that sound horrific.
It was such an established edition, and that's when I jumped in. And it was very complicated. Very much, I had 3 pages of keywords to reference when using units, and it was very much I could charge orcs into some Space Marines, and they'd hit me first because of initiative. There was almost like there was no incentive for my orcs to exist, and it was a bit of a challenge getting back into the game. I was like, I don't know how I stuck it out because it was
weren't you summoning bloodthirsters with your orcs as well?
Yeah, at desperation, I was doing things like I was being possessed by bloodthirsters, summoning demons. It was a little
because that hurts me from like an immersion standpoint, right? I can't stand that. That doesn't feel fair on the orcs.
I never played a tournament of 7th. But I was hearing about the Tau and Eldar allies thing, and it just made me feel quite uncomfortable. I'm not going to lie. When it became so easy to kind of abuse. But from a rule standpoint, I think if you were playing at a competitive level, it was a good game. That's the thing. I
Sure.
think people did enjoy it.
Yeah.
I enjoyed playing it at the time, but I didn't like that the missions were so basic. So I used to play Maelstrom, which is essentially the precursor to the mission decks we've got now. And that was fun because it was just like there was a bit of randomness that meant that my opponents couldn't just brute force me to death. And
yeah, absolutely. I'm going to keep picking out things from the chat as well. So some people saying it's been dumbed down. I'd say 10th is more dumbed down than 9th. It's still much more complex than 8th. 8th was not complicated to play. Right? 8th really wasn't. We've got Chris Clark asking, what do you think about the charge phase and no psychic? And that's what I was going to come back to. So psychic, they've demonstrated they can do it because I think Thousand Suns felt like a genuinely psychic army in this edition. Yeah. I think they obviously it's taken them a long time to figure out how to balance T-Suns, whether they actually have or not. But I think they can write army rules in and capabilities in that make them feel like they have psychic prowess. We're going to be interesting to see with the Eldar stuff because obviously, there's more by way of psychic weaponry and stuff in the new Eldar book. So maybe that'll juice up. But I also don't like psychic being treated as just a weapon because I enjoyed the psychic phase a lot. I thought it was good fun.
Yeah. And I think the challenge is it's a haves and have-nots thing. Like when there's a weapon you don't have an answer to. So this was a real problem I had. I think it was in 9th where there was... You could have a feel no pain, but it didn't work. It only worked on mortal wounds, or an early edition where there was the whole dev wounds thing, where suddenly your feel no pains meant nothing because there was this new dev wounds thing that just deleted stuff. So I feel like psychic can be like that, and that's why I think that it's been probably a bit more grounded so far this edition.
Yeah, for sure. I suppose I don't think one thing we didn't actually touch on is I do feel like 10th is genuinely quicker and snappier to play than 9th was.
It's still a very slow game when you look at comparative tabletop games, but that's because they like us having lots of models because they want us to buy a lot of models.
Yeah, I haven't really looked at army size comparative to other editions. They're certainly big, right? They're certainly big.
It's definitely grown.
Andy says he joined in 8th, and as a learner casual, it was awfully unbalanced. Yeah, I'd agree with that. I felt like I got dropped. I say we talk about the casual and pickup games. I came into 8th playing in a very chilled local scene, and everyone just kicked my Death Guard in with their armies and enjoyed doing so. Even in our crusade, they were just testing their competitive armies and kicking them in. And these are all players who would continue to describe themselves as casual, and would probably see me as more of a competitive one now. Yeah. But they taught me what competing was by not having no chill in fun games. So that's kind of my actual stance on local casual players, is that they're often a lot less chill than they like to think they are.
Yes.
Because I had to learn to be competitive to survive them, not real comp players. I didn't meet them for quite a long time. Bodge's point about free war gear is interesting. So I'm getting over the free war gear thing. I think I used to obsess over the granularity of list building a lot. And you do lose that intent. Yeah. But what I like is all of the... I really do like the units actually bringing the weapons that make them flavorful. You think about infantry, I like that they can just have the good weapons, and they're not going to be min-maxed into just being some guys with bolters, right? That does feel better to me, I think, in the main. There are a few egregious examples. But I don't really hate that at all. Goodness, chat is going off today. Arad, is asking about whether Grotmus was a possible future release model for Detachments. I mean, that was the exciting thing with this. And I think you can't really have a rules download like that without the detachment system. I don't know what you think, John.
What that tells me is that the biggest weakness of 10th edition has been you buy a book, the book is not relevant or valid apart from the code in the back that's part of a subscription model to use an app. So that tells me this should be, in my opinion, the last edition they do release books in the way they do, because it's so backwards. Like, if they could just go, right, you subscribe, you pay £2.50 a month and you get access to your army.
Yeah.
Cool. And then you get these updates, and then you don't feel like you've bought something that's out of date already. And that's, I think, the biggest obstacle then if you're a casual player, is you come back in, you bring your book out and someone goes, sorry, none of that's actually right. And you're sat there at the tabletop about to play the game going, what are my rules then? And that's a barrier of entry.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a shame.
Completely. The chat's having a discussion about the balance side. I don't think there's any case to answer that 10th is the most balanced that I've played. So
it's better.
It just categorically is. I mean, Pancakes, for example, in the chat is saying we often confuse good editions with their favourite faction being strong. I think this is the only edition I've played in where for most of the time it's existed, genuinely talented players can win events with the armies they want to play. This is the only one. I think for 8th and 9th, you had to be playing one of the new things to have come out at the right time and be a good player. I think we've seen a huge diversity of results for different armies in terms of doing well at events and competing, and just locally being playable. And that's due to very proactive balancing, I'd say. I
think the biggest thing that when I'm looking at it from the outside now is terrain is functional. It does a job.
Yep.
But it is
it's a compromise, isn't it?
It's a symptom. It's fixing a symptom that the game is too lethal still. That you have to have these big bricks of terrain. And it's a real oversight to me still that Games Workshop don't just go, here's some terrain you can use. And they can write terrain rules. I've seen it with the current edition of Kill Team. There's very interactive and nuanced terrain rules. You scale that up and it would work.
Yeah.
It's about keywords.
It does feel like there's still progress to be made on the terrain front. I do agree with that. And I did really enjoy the very immersive tables before things got more sort of homogenized. That was a good time. Andy doesn't like the Codex app code thing. I do understand that. I think gatekeeping the app was a mistake potentially for them.
Because then there's that element as well where you're playing your opponent and you can't see their rules.
Yeah.
And that always felt a bit weird, especially at events. Just like someone says, "Oh yeah, trust me, it says it in my book." You're like, "No, can I look at your book?" And it's even worse now because it's their phone. You can't say, "Can I borrow your phone a second to read that?" It's just it feels weird.
A-Red's right there. It's just greedy. I think the Index era where all the armies got the rules for free, that was awesome. But then Gate sort of paywalling it out, I don't think it was needed. I feel like GW definitely making a lot of money, and it does genuinely slow people down. Exactly. I think Battlescribe was always a big cause of my purchases because you'll suddenly find a unit on there and open it up, right? So it's in their interest, I think, to have the rules accessible. That's personally how I see it, but obviously they've made their decision. I don't like that aspect of it. I do think having lots more access to the rules online is good, though. Valentin's remembering the Necrons starting at 100 points and you having to stop them. Yeah, faction secondaries, I can see what they were trying to do with it, but that's kind of what I was meaning when it says you got a lot of holding pattern games. I felt like armies could just do their thing. I remember Harlequins, I'd play against Chris, he'd just be doing his things, right? Yeah, and it didn't matter what I did.
Take them off their thing, you win. If you don't, they've won. And then that became 100%. A bit of a non-entity, right? You just come to a table and go, oh, I can't go through 30 Deathwing Terminators that only wound on 4s. Looks like you're going to hold that objective all game then.
Absolutely.
That's not a game. I hated playing like that.
There's definitely got a bit of debate in here about accessibility as well. And I do feel like the game's incredibly accessible at this stage. I think, as John says, keeping up with it, I think unless you come in and are used to and happy with that very rapid process of updating, I can understand why for some players who their preference was you got a book, you had it for 3 years or whatever, and that was it. Yeah. I can understand why that's going to feel very, very different. But personally, I like patches and updates. I don't see many computer gamers going, oh, I wish they'd just release this and leave it as it is for 3 years. And most of the Warhammer players I know are also computer gamers, so I'm a little confused they can't get their head around regular updates, but that's the way of it, I guess. What do you think, Squid?
I think it's that element that the basic stuff should be like, you should be able to look at a data sheet, you should be able to look at the rules of an army, and then if they want to find a way of making it be you pay for extra, sure. But it doesn't have to be the rules. The rules are the bit that empower, like you said, purchases. For me, like Kill Team, I can sit and read all the Kill Teams on the app because they are all just free or as PDFs. And you just go, okay, I like that, the sound of that one. And then you go and buy it. That is such a win for them. Like,
100%.
An oversight. So
yeah, for sure. And I think we've got a bit of chat in the chat about having one payment to unlock all of it. And I sympathize with that, right? If you can unlock all the rules on the app just with a sub, I think people would very readily do that.
You wouldn't bat an eyelid at paying 10, 15 quid if you were going to a tournament once a month or playing a couple of pickup games a month. If you knew you had the access to all the updated rules and it made sense, you would. It's just
Chris Clark making the point that he doesn't know what rules docs he'd need to read online to enter a tournament. I think for competing, I think just diving in would feel quite daunting because you would be out of date inevitably if you were going on what you picked up, right? And I say in 8th, I found that even picking up Mid-Death Guard, and you find out that the state of the game is very different. Yeah. But I think a more integrated sort of pathway to playing at events would be quite useful for people. And it's tricky to pull that off, though, right? I guess GW has only really recently started to properly integrate itself with competitive play.
Yeah, and with the digital elements, like they did for a
Mm.
while do digital books you could buy. The fact that there's still a department that deals with books and box games tells me they're not going to stop doing books, which feels very short-sighted. But that's why we get books that get
I think-
printed and add
Yeah.
points in the back straight off the bat, because that's a department trying to hit their profit and loss.
Yeah, completely. I think the books is an interesting one. I like the books. I'm a book man. I enjoy codexes. I don't mind if the points change or whatever else. I think it can be a bit tricky to say. For armies I've been trying to pick up the last couple of weeks, their data sheets are very different now because they've had patch buffs, right? So actually, that is a bit frustrating if you're trying to find exactly what the up-to-date rules are, and they've changed. And I can see the potential risk with that. But certainly for me, I guess the codex is always more than the rules anyway. It's always the artwork and the stories and everything else in there. I really enjoy that about it.
But I think they do less of that now in the books. So I'd almost want them to go, here's a book full of lovely pictures and lore with a code in the back, and that's giving you
just that. No one's buying just the lore, though, are they?
You buy that rather than trying to.
Oh, I see. The code just unlocks the rules somewhere else,
and have everything else that's kind of their flavor and color and all that interesting stuff that gives it more of a focus. And then the book almost doesn't go out of date in that respect.
Yeah. Alex has got an example from his weekend event where someone charged Nurglings into an action doing Deathly Night Squad, thinking that turned off the action. And they had a TO ruling and they ruled against Alex. Yeah, I mean, that's tough. And you do get this. I mean, again, that's as long as I play, TOs are often drawn into edge cases where they don't really know and they have to make a call, right? And I guess that's just the nature of it. But with regular updates, there's a lot more scope for that. If your busy event runners are not actually plugged in and playing as much, they're much more vulnerable to the change.
That feels like an oversight on the TO. As much as anything,
yeah, it is and it isn't, right? I think it's a lot to ask TOs to be completely up to speed on every army and every interaction. Don't know. Maybe you feel differently. I think TOs do a lot. So
yeah, but that's the thankless job they're doing. They chose to do the job. So to me, I feel like if you're going to be a TO, if you don't get the answer immediately, go and check. But
yeah.
It's never
We've
easy.
got Pancakes making that, I think, very valid point that regular updates mean that underpowered armies get brought up. This is the thing. I've played a bunch of armies that have been essentially brought back into competing by rules changes. Votan, Drakari, GSC, I played them all this edition. They were all pretty bad and they've all become better thanks to patches and updates. And I just think that's good. I think that's a good model. It means I'm actually able to play things and know that they'll come good rather than having to jump on and buy some new hotness. I've just seen with our whole team, people have just played what they want to play for most of the edition. And there's moments, there's often moments, but actually the people's identities around the armies they like have been much more stable in this and much less shaped by just the whirlwind of stuff coming out.
Like I did dip back into my orcs, but because I wasn't really enjoying how they played, I didn't have this kind of non-entity of like, well, I don't have an army to play because they've already nerfed my other army, because Dark Angels have always been at least playable in the edition.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. As I said, for yourself with Dark Angels and Orcs, exactly. You've just been able to do that.
Yeah.
I think there's other stuff. I mean, the permissibility around stuff like Marines is interesting. I don't know how, we and I have talked about this before. I do feel like 10th has slightly diluted the identity of the different Marine chapters, which is a little bit sad. That's one casualty in the simplification. Yeah. But it works okay. Okay, right?
I think my biggest frustration with seeing 10th evolve and adapt and change so quickly is that it contrasts massively that I think Francois mentions it, that the Codex lore is mostly a reprint.
Yeah.
And then since Ox of Omen, there has been nothing moving really forward in the lore. There's been a couple of books that have come out, but even then, nothing's pushed it forward. And I almost feel like it's such a lost opportunity that kind of in sync with as things are coming out, and there's the Eldar book drops now. Why isn't there a book kind of exploring who Lycus is and what the heck, why? Like, it feels like a missed opportunity to me, because like when the Lion dropped and then I got a book about him finding himself, it was I was so engaged. It was so glorious. And
Ox of Omen did some cool stuff. I feel like they normally do the moving the story along at the end of an edition, right?
And that
because that's when Ox was. That's when
3 years just to have anything move. Like, I'm not saying like every month there should be a new book, but like if a codex drops, why isn't there something tied into it? Like Votan have had one novel, and they've been in the game 4 years now, 5 years almost. That's a long time to wait just for like a snippet. And it's free money, right? Like, not everyone wants to be playing the game, but they want to be reading and understanding the lore. There's that kind of part of the market as well, which
again, I'm going to counter your point. Most local players I've met don't give a shit about the lore.
But
like your average pickup game player doesn't give a damn about the lore, right? Yeah. So people like yourself, where you're very immersed in it, do care. I care. I enjoy it. I actually think the vast majority of players have no interest in, other than the surface level. They're not bothered. They don't mind. I've just not met many people who really cared. Like, they like the memes and the interactions around it.
And maybe that's because it's not there for them to read easily. Like, the fact you have to go and seek it out.
I feel like that's putting a them problem on GDOS.
No, but just to
I
me,
think we're getting it the wrong way around.
I know.
Like, it's interesting.
People like the kind of the breadcrumbs, they might read it, but when it's nothing new, like, when was the last time, realistically, you looked at a codex and thought, I want to read what happened in, like, since the last book and compare?
Yeah,
it just doesn't happen.
Completely. And we've got Chris Clark again talking about GW trending in the right direction. This is kind of where my optimism is, right? I think there has been frustration because certain lessons were sort of unlearned. Yeah. Particularly around things like indirect, a little bit around things like fights first. There were a few missteps, and again, dev wounds. There were a few very egregious missteps in balance at the start of the edition, but those have been sorted out fairly quickly. If you look at the overall state of the game at the moment, I'm seeing people running all combat. That's working. I'm seeing people running shooting armies. That's working.
It's not an answer, is there? It's not like
there's not a single thing.
way to play each army.
Yeah. If you were like, what is the list to go and win an event with right now, there would be several different answers. And I think almost every army in the game, I think maybe Sisters are probably the outlier. You could equip someone brand new to go and play that to a decent standard into most other armies in the game. And that's a really nice position, I think, for things to be in. It'll be interesting to see whether they layer on more or not. I guess we've seen stuff like Battle Focus, right? Think about New Eldar. That's adding a layer of complexity. That's quite a lot of complexity in Eldar rules play. And certain armies have that, and others really don't. Yeah, exactly. It's what they need, right? They should be quite complicated. And we've got Alex saying there's 700 players at ITT, and the variations in team comp are amazing. Yeah, from a team standpoint, it's really lively, right? It's very interesting. There's so many different ways to slice it. And again, there's not... So I remember when we did teams in 9th, you just had to have certain armies because they would batter everything. You had to have it. And we're not talking, you lose. We're talking 20-0s. These things just 20-0 anything they play.
That doesn't happen anymore. Like,
you really don't have that.
Last year.
Yeah, you really don't have that.
Odd outlier, but that was player skill a lot of the time.
And that makes a massive difference in terms of the quality of game and experience because, players just getting completely shellacked, nothing they can do. I think now when players lose hard, it's usually a massive skill disparity that's the biggest factor. It can be like just a statistical mismatch in armies.
Get diced, right? Like,
yeah, you can get diced for sure.
It does sometimes just go a bit wrong. That and the cards just being really in the wrong place at the wrong time. But then maybe your army's not right for the cards.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It definitely doesn't. I've had a lot less games where I feel like I've just lost on matchup before I've even started, and there was nothing I could have done to reduce it. So it's interesting. There are one or two armies out there I'm a little bit concerned about. I guess Slanesh is one where I'm not sure. That one feels very, very strong, but I just need to actually play against it and see. I think in the main, we've covered the main points I was looking to cover as far as the actual 10th edition goes. I guess it does beg a question: what would you like to see going forwards? If you wanted to build on it and make it better, more in line with what you're interested in. What for you personally would you like to see? I have a couple of thoughts, but I'll let you go first.
Dynamic terrain, so it actually matters.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that something that gives the same experience for things like there being heavy, obscuring stuff, but it doesn't have to be a fucking ruin. Because there's nothing worse than you play on the table and going, it's containers or ruins, and that is all you get. And that just feels like a kind of an oversight. And they're being...
It'd be nice to see like Death World Forest stuff, all that cool stuff.
And then having a function to it. And I'm not saying like added extra rules, because we know what happens. You give things like plasma conduits rules, people use it as terrain, and then they forget about the extra fucking rules. So
I was going to say, having played AOS, every game of AOS I've played, we roll a bunch of dice at the start, we point at the buildings and say, this means that, and then we never interact with it ever again.
Yeah. I think that, and then there being another format to play in. Like, it used to be, I got bored of the normal rules, so I'd play Maelstrom in 7th or 8th. there isn't that alternative at the moment, and it feels very much if you're at kind of a bit of a slump with 40k, your other option is playing Crusade, which is very two-dimensional missions with a bunch of
I feel
paperwork.
like they probably need to overhaul Crusade altogether, don't they?
Yeah,
They need
it
to
should
find a
make it
more
easier.
fun way of doing narrative play
Yeah.
that is actually. And this is exactly the kind of players you might want to give it a go. Just can't keep up with the layers of rules needed.
It
I
becomes
think that for
harder.
me is a big thing. I think a big narrative and casual overhaul would be nice.
And I think I'd like to see the end of an edition, like editions in the formal sense. I want to see it done as seasons, like computer games do, where you go,
Yeah, we've just had that
here it
exact
is.
comment from Arad in the chat.
Because what's the bloody point? Like, you print a book, like a rule book. How many times have I used my Leviathan rule book since the edition started, realistically? Probably my first pickup game. Since then, I've not lumbered that around. I do this every edition. I buy the launch box. I've done it with AOS. I've got 3 or 4 of each of these big books. They just sit there, and it's a shame.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's a cool book, and God, they do put some nice artwork into them. But a lot of the time, it is just recycled. So putting that effort into other things would be much more useful. Just maintain the app, make the app literally a foundation, and just I think moving it forward in a kind of productive way to make it easier for people to access it, rather than it being out of date stuff, just feels the most positive steps.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Makes sense. Arad very much likes the idea of seasons as well. Likes everyone having rules at the start. So I suspect with 11, the existing rule set will carry through almost certainly. And then they will adjust and refine like they did 8th through to 9th. I do prefer those metas.
And it gives them the opportunity. They can go, right, going into this one, we're going to cycle out that in a year's time, the Grotmus detachments disappear, as an example. I'm not going to say they are, but you know what I mean? Or outlier ones that they think are going to need to be gone. Like getting rid of, say, the Yunari one because the Yunari getting their own book or something like that. They just preempt themselves and make it so that they'll cycle out, and it becomes this kind of moving kind of thing that you're always on this kind of treadmill of it. So it keeps going rather than it being a 3-year cycle where the last year of an edition, it's really hard to kind of justify getting into a new army because you're like, well, it's all going to change soon. I don't know if I want to. In a weird sort of way, right?
Yeah, I've definitely seen that affect people. I know that it has. It's never really bothered me, but I do understand it. I think it's one of those things that there is a lot of money and effort involved. So I think people, and this is kind of my point with that. I think the fact that people can just lastingly collect, like, let's say, one army over an edition now,
it's
and it would be fine. That helps a lot with that risk of being made redundant, as it were, a lot less. And with detachments, you've got a lot more ways of making a collection sing in different way. Obviously, they get that more right in some places than others, right?
Yeah.
And Pancakes is arguing that, the Wargear changes, as I say, I do fully see the debate on this. I fully see why you might feel that the granularity has been lost. And I every now and again, I would love to change it. But as Pancake says, actually, it does make you make real choices sometimes because you come up at that 10, 15 point. And actually, a whole unit has to go to allow a list to work. That I like the way the enhancements at their points kind of sit alongside units. That it's like that. There's just that kind of there's decision points there without it being too complicated. And as I said, I just think certain units are so much happier for being able to just always have their weaponry involved.
I think as well, historically, when you look at 9th, points were very seldom changed. And it was very much a last-ditch effort to change the points from the book. And the rules were even less often changed. In fact, it was basically not done. So I think if they went back and started trickling in Wargear, especially now where they've got the infrastructure of an app, I think it is possible.
Yeah.
But I don't think it needs to be on everything. Like, to me,
No,
I'd argue
completely.
it's like your sergeant getting to pick different weapons could have a different value, but then is it going to matter if it's a different chapter? And in my argument would be that sometimes it should be like, is a Yunari aspect warrior unit better than a Craftworld one? Like, should they be pointed differently? Should it be affected by your detachment, perhaps?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a bit more of that, right?
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely more of that. Francois is getting very angry about the idea of less capable people playing his game. That doesn't sound like something he's got any interest in. Arad says that the 3-year cycle needs to go away. So I think they've probably found that the 3-year cycle doesn't quite fit the needs and demands that they have in terms of production, right?
Well, look at Dev Wounds. They were probably writing that 3 years before it dropped, as an example. By the time they've come around to actually releasing it, they've already fixed the problems it it itself had, and they've not gone and kind of. So
Mhm.
maybe it's the situation where they should just keep the same version going, because it just otherwise you're just starting from scratch again, unless it needs a complete overhaul, which I don't think it
Yeah.
does.
I felt like ninth needed another year. I felt like ninth, if we'd had another year after the sort of arcs of Omen, I think that would have been really good. And so I hope maybe they'll learn lessons. And I think, as you say, maybe not having it so tied to the 3-year release cycle would free them up a bit to just develop and iterate on what they've got.
Because then you could have that situation where you have your season, you go, right, this year it's centered around this. Like they tried to with previous Grand Tournament packs, but they were always just like a flash in the pan, never seemed to be quite enough to it. Like there needs to be beef. So I'm going to come clean. I played quite a bit of League of Legends in the last couple of months. They have a season system, but what they do with it is it's all themed around like a theme to it, and that makes so much sense because it becomes engaging. It's a theme behind it that then you kind of go, oh, cool, that's the reason that's happening, and this, and it would be a way to move the lore on. But
they do that in AOS as well, don't they? To an extent,
they do and they don't. It's this weird thing where it just feels very flat. I don't know what they could do. Like they've started to trickle in. I'd
argue those AOS books do exactly what you've just said. That is exactly what they do. They change the comp scene. They change the comp scene based on a set of themes that are supposed to be lore linked. That is, they are copying that exact model.
Yeah. And then
from the outside, I don't play AOS very often, which means that when I check back in, I've usually missed that book.
Yeah.
And so it's exactly like you were saying earlier on, it leaves people behind. So that kind of sounds like
kind of touches with it as well. So they're starting to like there's this whole Return to Cadia thing. You're like, okay, I now understand a bit about that. But one video every 6 months isn't enough.
Yeah, for sure.
I would argue that they should be throwing more at that to then push the lore themed around it as well. But
Glasshammer Matt says I'm his favourite. Thank you, Matt. Love you. Donald Carey says 3 years is about getting the spike in share price. Yeah, ultimately, that is, I think, the recurring issue, right? It's just the need to constantly have these guaranteed booms in sales is always going to shape it to some extent. And I think the sell models argument is always a big part of what goes on. Yeah. But I don't know. I think there's been a much better mix on that side this time in terms of a range of collections feeling useful and part of it. And Stanley, I agree. I think if the themes they were running through and cycling through felt more defined and meaningful, that would be cool, right?
The last time that did was they did the 2 Vigilus books, and they were fantastic for kind of pushing a feel and a vibe around it. Whilst now we've gone back for the second time to the Prime Nexus, what relevance has it got that we're fighting in the Prime Nexus realistically? Nothing.
Yeah, it's true. It's not really been that relevant this time, has it?
It's just a name. That's a shame.
For sure. Yeah, so there's more they could potentially do there. And I agree, the potential of linking that to terrain would be interesting. I think ultimately the issue is with your big competitive circuit, having the terrain change all the time is quite rough for them. You're a TO and you're trying to put an event on, and suddenly the terrain you need is completely different.
Yeah,
you're chasing your tail a bit with that, so I can see why that's harder to pull off. But I do like the idea of the actual board being impacted by where you're playing and what you're doing. I certainly loved that when we've done more casual and narrative stuff as well.
Well, it works for Kill 2. There's 3 types of board, and it means that you can't build just for one style of board, which helps for balance as well.
Absolutely. I'm conscious Scrivo hasn't got too much more time, so we're going to start winding down. I'm going to natter with them a little bit about Eldar and Slanesh before we go. But if you in the chat have any questions for us, do feel free to fire them in, and we'll feed them. We'll field them if we deem them reasonable. So, Scrivo, as far as Eldar is concerned, have you had much of a look at the new Eldar stuff yet?
I have intentionally not looked at it at all.
Okay. Well, then you're not going to be much good for this, are you?
Well, I read some of the articles, but when everyone started getting very, either really upset or really excited, I was like, well, cool. Why would I sit on the table? Like, to me, sometimes you can read rules and go, that looks really busted.
Yeah,
and without the final points, that often means very little to me because I'm like, cool.
So I'm with Scrivo on this. There's my pitch for you, chat. Is the community's response to Eldar rules basically already decided, irrespective of what those Eldar rules are?
It's an emotional response.
I think looking around, I see people who were always going to hate it. I see people who were always going to love it. I see a lot of people who are hoping for power from it, and a lot of people who are sort of dreading, but also sort of expecting it to be too powerful. But it feels like with Eldar releases in particular, there's such a kind of social script that we all kind of carry into it. but not actually that many people who are diving into and thinking about and puzzling it out. If you haven't watched Vic's video about the 10 things he loves about the new Eldari Codex, go and watch that, by the way, because that's really cool. Gets really in depth on it.
That's my
but I think this is something people do with rule releases, and they're particularly bad with Eldar. They do it with other factions as well. But I think, do we need to just actually dig into and look at things as they come out for what they are, rather than carrying our preconceptions in? And are we particularly bad at this with certain armies? I think we are. Like Tau, I think would be another one. I think people are always ready to say Tau. People are always ready to be like, oh god, look at it, look what it does.
Like in 7th and 8th edition, those two armies were a real problem for a lot of people. So people have that memory of it now, and they're like, well, okay, so they're always going to be like that. And if they're not, they're like, well done, they're not good, great, and they're almost celebrating other people's sadness, which I find really quite
it's like a bit of a war,
really.
isn't it?
Yeah. Like at the end of the day, I want everyone to be able to use their toys and for it not to feel like a non-entity. So I want Eldar players to play, but I want them to have to earn their wins. And I'm not saying that they weren't before, but I think this, right?
I mean, I would say that the 10th release Eldar rules were brainless, right? They were awful and brainless to the point that I didn't play the army because I just couldn't reconcile just how ridiculously easy to play that was. This doesn't feel like that. I think I've already played against it a couple of times, and it's a puzzle, and the player can get it wrong. And particularly if you're playing with the aspects, and I think probably the aspects is the most fun way to play the new book. I don't know if it's the most powerful, but it is the most fun way to play it. It is not brainless by any stretch, and it does live or die a bit by positioning and comboing. And it can fold up pretty quickly. We've got a question from Arad. Yeah, they do just die.
Tom. My God.
Yeah. Question from Arad in the chat for Tom and Scribber. If you could bring back just one thing from previous editions, what would it be? What would you bring back, Scribber?
The 2nd edition shock attack gun rules.
2nd edition shock attack gun rules. See, there you go. You ask a player what they'd bring back, and it's just something strong that they had. That's all they really want.
Tom. It was rolling dice, and there was a slight chance you could literally eat a dreadnought from the inside with a snotling, or you could blow yourself up, funny. Or blow up your own units. It didn't matter, but it was fun.
That is really fun. Gordon Chung says hello. Hi, Gordon. Thing I would bring back. I'm gonna just pick a really biased thing as well. Just make Drazar what he was in 9th. I love Drazar.
No,
it was so good. It's actually an interesting conversation. I don't know how other players feel. I thought Fights Last had a logical and sensible place in the game. It still exists in AOS. We have Fights First now, and they've kind of finessed it to have not the complete end of the fight chip sequence, but actually have other things butting in. I actually think Fights Last as a combat control piece wasn't a terrible thing to have in the game. But I don't know how other people feel. Do we miss that? Am I biased because I like to play armies that bully people?
The way they kind of engineered it into AOS for 4th edition is very much you can give a unit it, or there is a unit will have it. Having the Emperor's Children equivalent of the end of 9th, that was quite a negative play experience. You could play around it, sure, but it still felt a little miserable. If you were a combat army going into that and you didn't have an answer outside of your combat, you're like, cool. Looks like I'm just going to lose this game, and that's a shame. There is an answer to it, but I don't think it is as simple as just putting it back in.
Yeah, it makes sense. Arad says Drazar killed Gilliman and a lion at an event he was at. Yeah, I mean he's actually not terrible now. He's just merely okay, and that's not what anyone's about. All right, I think that's probably going to do it for today. I don't want to keep Scribber for too much longer. I know he's got back to go get back and get busy. But just to shout out all the things we've got going on the channel, we've got tons of videos coming out this week. We have live streams tomorrow night where we'll be talking about mastering combat armies with Raphael Harbinson, and on Thursday night we've got a fight night which I believe is Necron's Dark Angels, and then loads of smaller videos coming out as we go. Thank you very much everyone who's turned in and commented. You have confirmed a great deal of what I think about things in 40k. So I'm grateful to all of you for the role you've played in doing that. And do hit the old like, subscribe, do leave us a comment. If you want to sign up and support us as a member, go for it. If you'd like to get some coaching, come drop me a message, I'll help you out. Final question for Donald Carey before we run. What do you think Emperor's Children will bring to 40k? I think speedy melee with a very, very scary speedy Primarch. And I would be interested to see what their actual rules integration of it are. But EC in general just sit in a really nice, fast, but slightly glass cannon-y place amongst the Chaos factions. I think what I'm very curious about is how they managed to make conceptual distance between them and World Eaters.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, EC gets shooting. You've got to find a way to make the EC combat not so good that basically it's like, oh, it's World Eaters, but you also get guns, right? That's always the thing I'm curious about.
So I like the idea of Noise Marines suppressing units to make them fight last. So you have to do a thing to get your fight first. So it becomes about the synchronization of your two parts in harmony. That perfect style of combat, perhaps.
It'll be interesting to see. There's a lot of EC fans out there, so we'll obviously go in depth on that because we have arguably one of the UK's most dedicated Emperor's Children players in our ranks. And that's Lee Churchwood, for anyone who's wondering.
I was going to say who?
Not Connor Nichols, although I have bet Connor Nichols that if he will play just Emperor's Children for a year, I will pay for his Fulgrim. If he doesn't, he's paying for mine. Who do you think's made a good bet there?
So what he doesn't realise is you're going to glue his Fulgrim together as well.
Oh, man. All right, we're out of here, guys. Thanks very much for tuning in. We'll see you on Tuesday night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.